Ladies and gentlemen, may I respectfully invite you to please take a seat. Please find a seat. If I don't seat for you, please feel free to sit on the floor. We're going to start now. All the guests to come in and let's be seated so that we can get started. First of all, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the Petroleum Club and Access Bank that little later than advertised. Persons will be joining us. I'm going to be inviting the chairman of the Petroleum Club, Dr. Lai Fatana, to welcome us to this special oil industry dinner, which is being presented by the Petroleum Club in partnership with Access Bank PLC, and he would also introduce the the keynote speaker, and we'll get on right away to our program for this evening. Dr. Lai Fatana, please. Ladies and gentlemen, so it's the Petroleum Club, and I if you didn't know, you are allowed to clap. So can we have a round of applause, please? Thank you.
Good evening, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to acknowledge the presence of the advisory board of the Petroleum Club, Dr. Sweli and Mrs. Sweli. It's a pleasure to have you and all other members of the advisory board. I want to welcome the keynote speaker, the guest keynote speaker for this evening, my brother, Mr. Benga Oyebode. Benga, thank you very much. It was a very pleasant surprise to see you here in person. I know you will do many things for many people, and therefore we're not taking this for granted. We know that you have taken a lot of detour to be here this evening for this occasion. I will then recognize other distinguished speakers. My elder, Mr. Agbati Momo, I'm not going to introduce you. You are nothing but an industry veteran, so and we're having you today as a distinguished speaker. Welcome, and I know you are also one of us on the advisory board, so you wear so many caps today, so I don't know whether to treat you as an outsider or as an insider. I would keep my welcome for Herbert Wigwe, the CEO, Group Managing Director of Access Bank. Bite Adeniji is somewhere. I'm told he's in very, very far remote part of Africa, attending to the call of business. My colleague members of the Board of Governors and various committees of the Petroleum Club, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to stand on other existing protocol. Yet again, and for the second time in 3 months, and on behalf of the Petroleum Club of Lagos, I welcome you to the third quarter business dinner today. Under the full sponsorship of Access Bank, PLC. For us, this is a very special event for the Petroleum Club. And even though Herbert is not here, but I think I want to address Herbert personally. I will still welcome him, or we will welcome him whenever he shows up. But Herbert is not yet a member of the Petroleum Club. And we take pride in welcoming people to this unique gathering of one of Nigeria's non-political, non-profit making. I know that will not appeal to him as a banker. But for what we do, policy advocacy is our business. Yet, we're industry focused. The Petroleum Club has a membership number that is waiting, reserved for Herbert. This event is the first of its type between a bank and our club. And it is so unique that we don't want to miss the opportunity. It has taken so much time to cultivate, and it is one of its kind. Now that we have consummated it, we hope it will be ongoing and that it will be mutually rewarding for both of us, both the sponsors and the one that is being sponsored, which is us. And our main focus here is that we want to partner with Access Bank in promoting industry-related dialogues. I have been told that this is going to be a yearly and forward-going event. So thank you very much, Access Bank. at each of our gatherings with non-members and outsiders, we always want to make clear who we are, what we do, and what the guiding principles are on which we congregate and make pronouncements on. We are still Nigeria's major network and collective of what I usually describe as gray to white-haired, distinguished gentlemen and ladies of the Nigerian energy industry. If you are part of us, you are either currently or you have served your term at the highest levels of management. You are all, or we are all seasoned professionals, administrators, policy formulators, and or enterprise owners in the wide spectrum of the energy spread. At our last meeting, it was here in this hall on the 14th of July. We had a guest speaker, one of the most powerful regulators of any sector of the economy. He was the director and CEO of the now defunct Department of Petroleum Resources. Engineer Sarki Awalu, I actually invited him to this event today. He was addressing us on what we considered then a major subject of concern to the country and our industry. He spoke on the future of the Nigerian petroleum industry. But I must ask, does it really, or do we really have a future for the Nigerian petroleum industry? I'm not going to answer that question. At that event on the 14th of July, in my introductory remarks, I offered our guest speaker membership of the Petroleum Club. I predicted then, too, that this is where he belongs whenever his tenure finishes. Well, I did not realize that I was seeing so close to the future. Today, both the Department of Petroleum Resources and the erstwhile director, they vanished from our screen. And this must worry us, because even before this event at the Petroleum Club, we have spoken, we have discussed, we have advocated about our institutions. So, what has happened reminds us of our efforts. The gathering of this evening is very privileged, and the keynote speaker, no better qualified individual other than Mr. Gbenga Oyebode, Chairman, Management Board of Alukwan Oyebode, with three others, very distinguished speakers, our own Egbati Momo. Again, I'm not going to introduce him. A thoroughbred of the industry, professional, of many years standing, and Herbert, the CEO and Group Managing Director of Access Bank, who are the sponsors of this evening's event. And my friend, Bitiade Niji, equally well known to so many of us here. So in effect, we bought one, but we are getting three free. So they will all be taking on a new aspect of our several major concerns, the Petroleum Industry Act, which had just been signed into law, and it is on a rapid pace of implementation. Today, they dwell and delve into the bowels of how this new act will shape another major impacting activity within the industry, which, for clarity, is the divestment and matters arising. As usual, we always strive to present in our gathering matters of significant interest to our industry. The interrogations that we follow the presentations are always what I look forward to. And I know that this is not going to be any exception. It's going to be very, very interesting. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all. Have a very, very nice and enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, sir. And we're going to go straight on to have our keynote speaker. I'm sure in the programs in front of us, we have the profiles written. I can assure you that all that is written about Mr. Gbenga Oyebode is a very, very brief summary that does not do justice to all his achievements and to all that is worth. But one thing that I can say on a personal note is that he's one person who, although he began in the practice of law, has over time gone from being a lawyer to being an investor to being an influencer to being one who has a very strong voice in the industry. He tries to be modest about it, but the truth is, it is with a great sense of privilege that we will be welcoming him to give the keynote address this evening. And before I invite Gbenga, I'd just like to quickly read a few things from the profile in front of you. Gbenga co-founded Aluko and Oyebode with Bankole Olumide Aluko, SAN in 1993 after leaving Ajumobugobia, Okeke at Oyebode and Aluko in 1992. He's currently the chairman among several companies of CFAO Yamaha Motor Nigeria. He serves on the board of MTN Nigeria Communications, Nestle Nigeria PLC, and many others. He's on the Africa Advisory Board of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. He's also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. He retired as the director and chairman of Access Bank, PLC, after 13 years of taking leadership roles at the bank. I paused there because in case you may be wondering what's the connection, yes, the connection is there. Without saying much ado, I'd just like to say one other personal note, not in the profile, is that Gbenga Oyebode is a lover of the arts and is a lover of music, is a promoter, is an enabler, is a financier, is a good donor, and is a supporter of many arts institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we will also be introducing to you a partner of one of this country's leading law firms, Templars, Mrs. Zelda Akindele, who would be taking over from me to moderate the rest of the speaking engagements this evening. So my task is done. And I will hand over to Mr. Gbenga Oyebode. Please welcome Gbenga Oyebode. Wait. You know why I asked him to wait? People are taking pictures here. I never like standing next to him when they're taking pictures. The contrast is good for the show. So keep your distance while I go. Thank you. Welcome, Gbenga.
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First to say thank you very much to the Petroleum Club for inviting me to speak this evening. Dr. Lai Fatono, was calling me about a month ago. We missed each other several times, and then the next thing I was getting calls from Yemi Akinsoya. So I knew that my time was up. And maybe I shouldn't be saying thank you because I'm also a founding member of the Petroleum Club. So this is a homecoming of sorts. So thank you very much for. Just a quick aside, Yemi and I have known each other for very many years. We lived in New York together, God, 40 odd years ago. And Yemi used to work at Sullivan and Cromwell on Wall Street, and I used to work at White and Case. And we've developed a relationship around not just the law, but also the oil and gas business. And when Yemi left Sullivan and Cromwell, he went on to work at ExxonMobil, and it was one of the reasons why I left White and Case and went off to work for the old Gulf Oil Company. For those of you that are not old enough to know, Chevron took over Gulf Oil thereafter. But it's a bit difficult to talk about the PIA in 15 minutes, and that's what I've been told to do. I'm going to try and hit some high points, and I suspect that the panel, the distinguished speakers that will come after me, Egbert Imomo, Gbite, Adeniji, and Herbert Wigwe, would be able to speak to some of the things that I will deliberately leave out, because it's just not possible to do all of this in the time that we've agreed. But let me say very quickly that we know that the PIA has been signed. We know that it's taking some time to get here. And I think for me, it's one of the key issues that I would like to focus on. The missed opportunities over the last 20 years, and why I still think there's a lot of work to be done. So very, very quickly, just to run through implementation. And I think if the slides are up, that's slide 2, but I'll just keep going on. The important thing for me is about how, because we are late to the game of a change in the law, we've moved very, very swiftly. The President has inaugurated the steering committee. The boards have been put in place for both the Upstream Regulatory Commission and the Midstream and Downstream Authority. NNPC itself has become a limited liability company owned by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Petroleum. So that's a good sign of where we want to go and what we need to be doing. I think it's important that we recognize that these two regulatory agencies have taken over the functions of DPR particularly. And those functions are, we hope that the functions taken over by both the Commission and the authority will be carried out in a business-like manner. That's what we expect of the changes that we see, or the changes that have taken place. One of the things that I wanted to identify, just to put a marker on the ground, is how the Act has grandfathered in existing licenses. There's going to be voluntary conversion to the new PIA regime, or there will be involuntary conversion at the point of renewal for existing licenses. And I think that's important. We're going to talk a little bit more about the divestment issues, but I think it's important to understand that the whole essence of the grandfather provisions will only last until the existing licenses come up for renewal. And then again, just to focus on the fact that license names have changed, but the essence of them still remain the same. So oil exploration licenses become petroleum exploration licenses, oil prospecting licenses become petroleum prospecting licenses, and mining licenses become petroleum mining licenses. I think one of the key things that the Act has done is clarified how we look at marginal fields, and I think that should be important for the new marginal field regimes that we're starting to see. The reality is that we've always wondered whether marginal fields, where they fell in the scheme of things. So we now know for a fact that marginal fields will become petroleum mining leases. And that's the consequence of a new law that deals with a vacuum. I think it's also important to just talk about the incorporated joint venture model. And I think the reason it's important is that we've talked a lot about the funding difficulties of NNPC. We've talked about why cash calls haven't been met. Well, this is the answer to all the problems we've had with financings, with the shortfalls in cash calls, and with the ability of joint venture partners to take investment decisions swiftly without being caught in a political problem. Let me very quickly just spend some time talking about midstream and downstream operations. I think it's just important just to put a marker on the ground with respect to what the Act, how the Act sees midstream and downstream operations. Two things that I just wanted to focus on, and we know that the authority that's been created will regulate this part of the activities. But I just wanted to make two key points, really around the decommissioning and abandonment fund, which must be put in place. Contributions to that fund shall be based on decommissioning and abandonment provisions and plans that are approved by the authority. Second point I wanted to make was around the midstream and downstream gas infrastructure fund, where 0.5% of wholesale price of petroleum products and natural gas sold in the country will go towards that fund. And also around the midstream and downstream regulatory authority fund, similar amount that will go to funding the authority. The reason I want to put these, note all of these, is that when you add up all of these funding mechanisms that we've put in place, what we need to understand is that somebody is going to have to pay for this. So please let's understand that when you put 1% aside, the consumer is paying at the end of the day. So it's not just that we're trying to fund the authority or we're trying to fund a decommissioning fund. We're passing on the cost to somebody else. And when you look at this piece of legislation, it's one of the things that comes naturally to us when we write legislation in Nigeria. We tend to want to take the burden away from government and say, oh, somebody else will fund it. Actually, the bottom line here is that the consumer is going to be paying all these set-aside costs that we have identified. Let me talk very quickly around the tax, and I think it's important that we understand that two tax regimes apply. Companies income tax at 30%, hydrocarbon tax at 30%, particularly for petroleum mining leases, totaling approximately 60% of tax regimes. Also, royalties and host communities development fund. I think it's important to just stress, people complain about why it's only 3%. I'd like to think that that's just a beginning. If you set aside 3% of annual operating expenditure, which will go towards the host communities development fund, which is going to be put in place for the relevant host communities. There's a whole discussion around how we are going to recognize what host community is in which jurisdiction, in which locality, in which state, particularly for operators that span across different communities. Some communities that don't speak to each other at all, but they're going to have to share this 3% that we put in funds. Now that whole area will, we're going to have to put in place guidelines that will deal with what I'd like to think of as practical problems. Let me spend a bit of time talking around the royalty regime. I think one of the interesting things about this piece of legislation is that we've created two royalty regimes. Royalties based on a field basis and royalties based on price. I think one important thing, something that we haven't seen done in Nigerian legislation at all, is that we've set aside price-based royalty, which will go to funding the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I think that's an interesting development, given what we know, that other than the initial $1 billion allocation to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, they've had significant difficulty funding the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So that's a particularly important development. Let me talk a bit about divestments, since that's a subtopic of today, and I know that we will deal with it in a bit more detail later on this evening. But I think it's important to understand why there are divestments, why we're dealing with these issues today, why we do need a regime that captures the essence of divestments in the industry. One of the key reasons, as we all would recognize, is just the difficulty of operating in Nigeria. I think we need to understand that one of the more difficult operating environments in the world is Nigeria, particularly in the Niger Delta. And so we do need to put in place, a regime around why do people divest? Why are companies divesting? Why are they reducing operations onshore the Niger Delta? The other reason that I think we do need to understand is around the whole issue of energy transition, the fact that to achieve net zero emissions, international oil companies are having to deal with shareholders who are making decisions with respect to climate change, with respect to meeting targets that are set by governments around the world. So I think it's important to put that in perspective. Also, I have a list of companies that have partaken in divestments over the last 10 years. I think it's important that we recognize that we're not new to the divestment regimes. Some of the more significant indigenous players in the Nigerian oil industry have bought assets that have been divested by IOCs. And the view that I take is that this is going to continue, so it's important for us to be having this conversation around divestment. The Group Managing Director of NNPC already has made a commitment in the last couple of weeks, announcing that government will put in place a comprehensive regulatory regime around divestment. So let's understand that there will be increased opportunities, there will be increased announcements, there will be more announcements as we go along, but I think it's important that indigenous companies sitting around in this room should be ready to take up the opportunity that obviously is going to, we're going to be seeing very, very clearly. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was around not just divestments, but investments. I think the critical thing about PIA is that while one of its clear objectives was to drive investments in the Nigerian oil industry, and it's been able to do that, or at least set the stage for that, because it's reduced headline tax. We've seen some reduction in royalty rates. The Host Community Development Fund, we expect, will deliver some peace in the Niger Delta. We think that by repealing conflicting laws, it puts in place a level playing field, both in governance and regulatory, and in the regulatory environment. A word of caution that I would like to leave with really is the fact that while the law has taken us 20 years to get here, and with the what I would like to think of as delayed investment in the marketplace, I think it's better late than never to have passed the PIA at this time. The question all of us in the room have to ask ourselves is whether this isn't too little too late, given that the world is moving on with net zero emissions targets, that we are seeing significantly change investment criteria around the world. Also wanted to spend some time around the power of the minister to grant and revoke interest in petroleum leases. This has been, I'd like to say, looks on paper to have been significantly whittled down. Reason being that the Commission will make recommendation to the minister in respect of approvals, and that the minister has a time frame of 60 days to, not necessarily to approve, but to respond to the applications that have been made. Very, very quickly, let me just come to what I think of as the high point. It's a conclusion, but it's also the high points that I think we will be able to deliberate on later this evening. First thing is whether having a dual regulatory regime of both the Commission and the authority, whether that in itself is the way forward, given the fact that we recognize that all the different fees and that have been put in place actually come at a cost. They come at a cost to the consumer. Second thing is whether the host community allocation of 3% is adequate, meets the expectations and the aspirations of the communities in which all of us operate, and whether, when you look at the 30% Frontier Exploration Fund, what the ratios should be. Should we be giving communities 3% and 30% of NNPC profits to the Frontier Exploration Fund? Also wanted to talk about the modalities around the conversion contracts. The fact that we're not yet very clear about how these opt-in, opt-out modalities will work, and that we look forward to seeing the guidelines that will be issued with respect to the conversion contracts. In conclusion, one of the things that I think is important is that the Act is hydrocarbon-centered in a world that is becoming less focused on hydrocarbons. And I just wanted to use one example of why I think that's important for us to consider. So if you follow the stock markets, you will see that yesterday, Tesla reached $1 trillion valuation. So a car manufacturing company that doesn't have any cars on Nigerian roads is valued at $1 trillion. When you add the valuations of all the companies that all of us sitting in this room drive their cars, and I'm talking about Toyota, the biggest car manufacturing company in the world. Toyota is only valued today at $280 billion. When you add the valuations of everybody, Toyota to Mercedes-Benz, everybody else that all of us know, they're all valued at under $1 trillion. The signal that sends to us is that in actual fact, the future that we talk about is actually here with us today. And that the PIA as is presently written may not yet be fit for that future. It may be fit for today for Nigeria, but is not fit for the future that we all envisage. So I think it's important to understand that pension funds and strategic shareholders in the rest of the world are already offloading shares and are no longer investing in high carbon footprints, investing in clean energy companies. And that the one signal that we should take from the Saudi Arabian announcement a couple of days ago that said that Saudi Arabia was committed to zero emissions from the year 2060. So that's the biggest oil producer in the world, is committed to zero emissions. Now that should send us a signal of where the world is going. We are in the midst of the climate change conference, COP26, at the end of this week. Obviously, the world is focused on climate change and its effects, So this is not one of those trains that it's left the station already, and we should focus on why it's important to start rethinking government policy around hydrocarbons. Finally, we've waited 20 years for this piece of legislation. I think one of the things that I would like us to spend some time on, and those of us that are lawyers in the room know one thing for a fact. It is very usual for us to write great pieces of legislation in Nigeria. One that we spent time dimensioning, analyzing, and agreeing. But our biggest problem really is about execution. So it's not about the piece of paper, it's about whether we will live by the terms, whether we will allow transparency and good governance to prevail, whether there will be regulatory flip-flops where we don't understand what the policy that government is trying to adopt, whether all of us sitting in this room will stand by and let discretionary allocations that don't make any sense continue to happen, and whether there will be a lack of consistent application of the rules that we see in the PIA. So if I had to hazard a guess, it's a great piece of legislation. It's come a bit late in the day. Better to have it than not to have it. Government has already put in place a couple of amendments to the piece of to the legislation, which we expect, which, by the way, are things that are needed. I would like to implore all of us that we shouldn't assume that this PIA will just act through by itself. Our commonwealth sitting in the room and across the country should be brought to bear on policymakers, on regulators, on government, that this piece of legislation should be allowed to work. And I suspect that if we allow it to work, then we will also make the changes that are necessary to bring it up to speed with changes that we're starting to see across the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I had 15 minutes to do a broad brush of the PIA. We're going to have a very robust conversation with my fellow speakers who will come after me and the panel. But I think that if my job was to set the stage for the conversation that will come thereafter, I think I've been able to put the markers on the ground of where we are, where we expect to be, and how time is of the essence, and we should very, very quickly get government to move ahead with activating this legislation so that all of us can then get back to business as usual. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Ayobade. Good evening, everybody. I'd first like to thank the Petroleum Club for the opportunity to participate in this evening's session. It's already a very interesting one, and we certainly have delightful panelists that are coming up to speak. Mr. Ayobade certainly set the stage for this evening's discussions. You said you couldn't talk about the PIB in 15 minutes, but somehow you managed to do that actually. You took us through everything, from the regulators, to the gaps that have been filled in marginal fields, to these going to be paid to different funds, from the infrastructure fund to 3% for the host communities. And then you asked the very, very important question, which has possibly been an elephant in the room for not just the Petroleum Club, but the entire industry in Nigeria. After 20 years, is it too little, too late? And given that the PIA has come at a time when we're seeing another round of investments, what is the impact going to be? I don't think you could have set the stage any better. And it's actually made it very easy for me to introduce our panelists and introduce the discussions we're going to have. So in the context of the PIA, let's talk about the divestments. We're very honored this evening. We actually have possibly, I would say, the best trio possible to discuss, the divestments in the context of the PIA. I say that because we have, if I may borrow the language of our chairman, a veteran of the industry in Mr. Egbert Momo. We have a lawyer who has worked on policy and framework in the person of Mr. Adeniji. And then we have the person who brings the money, right, in Dr. Igwe, one of the foremost banks that finance these investments in the market, being Access Bank. So really, if we can't get to the bottom of these issues this evening and actually have a robust discussion, then really, I don't think there's anyone else that can, because with these three panelists, we're set to go, right? So on that note, before I introduce the panelists though, we would like, on behalf of the Petroleum Club, I would just like to recognize some of the personalities that are here with us this evening. I'd first of all like to recognize and acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Uju Ifejika, the Chairperson CEO of Britannia U. Welcome. I'd like to acknowledge and recognize the presence of Mr. Mike Sangster, the CEO of Total Energies Exploration. Good evening. Let's also recognize Christel Kavalik, the MD of Equinor Energy. We also have with us Alhaji Mumuni Dangazam, the CEO of OVH. Good evening, sir. I'll also have to recognize Ahonzi Nube, the MD of PETROLEUM Energy. You're all very welcome. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker on the panel this evening. It gives me great pleasure, and actually I feel honored to be introducing Mr. Egbert Momo. I'm not sure that he actually needs an introduction to this particular audience, but I think that it behooves me to actually just highlight some of his career high points. So, as we know, Mr. Momo is actually a petroleum engineer by strict profession, but I think that his participation in the industry probably goes beyond just the professions of being an engineer. He's worked both in Nigeria and internationally for Shell. He's worked in the UK and the Netherlands, and he eventually rose to the position of Deputy MD of SPDC Nigeria, a position which he occupied from 1997 until February 2002. And during those years of service, he presided over various committees and attended several external technical management courses. He's been a member of the SPC, the Society of Petroleum Engineers, since 1973, and was a founding member in Nigeria. He was made a distinguished member of the SPC International in 1999, and an honorary member, which is the highest award of the SPE in 2011. In that same year, he was also made a Commander of the Order of the Niger, CON, in November 2011. It is with great honor that I invite Mr. Egbert Momo to please speak to us this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, who is the controller of the presentations? Is it here or somewhere at the back? Can you raise your hand if you're the person, please? Because you need to follow the sequence of my presentations. You see, I'm a Shell-trained person. And the only way we know how to make presentations is to use view graphs. And the story is told of this Shell man who died, and he went to heaven. It shows all men can go to heaven. And he got to heaven. And St. Peter said to him, "How did you live your life?" Wait a minute. Hey, where are you going? I'm going to get my view graphs. So I'll try to make a presentation, but it has to be in a sequence. So please, when I say next, please show the next view graph. So can you please show the first one?
Ajibola, you confirm that this would work. Is it going to work? Okay. First view graph, please. Do you want my flash drive? Is it causing problems? I beg your pardon? I think we may have a problem, if you don't mind. Maybe I just take my flash drive there and see what's happening. Sorry, my apologies. I understand they're having some technical problems. I will then make this presentation without view graphs. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an opportunity which I really cherish to be here with you, and because I have been associated with the Petroleum Club at the very inception. So indeed, it's like coming home to give this presentation. The title I think we'll just start, and if they get it on, that's okay. The agenda of my presentation will look at first in why do companies divest? You heard some of it when the first speaker made his presentations. Then I'll talk a little bit about who the players are in Nigeria. And this issue whether divestments just started. And I'll then talk about what are the drivers, what is actually causing this phenomenon of people giving up their assets to leave. We then look at what the potential consequences are for divesting. And at the end, we'll draw some conclusions. So, I hope I'm not teaching my grandmother how to suck eggs by talking to this audience, by mentioning a few reasons why divestments take place. The first one is that one is a change of business environment, whether it's micro or macro. There could be financial requirements, e.g. the need to release capital, the need to strengthen the balance sheet, the need to upgrade an underperforming portfolio. Maybe it's an opportunity to enter a new business line. And also, you could get a mouth-watering offer if you didn't want to divest. Somebody comes and gives you a huge amount of money, valuing your company much higher than what you thought. Okay, let's go. And last but not the least, you may want to divest because you want to avoid competition in any particular sector in which you are. Other reasons are political changes. Change of government, new regulations, we heard about the PIA, labor laws, new tax regimes. The other reason may be change of management. If a new company, if a new management team enters a new company, they may decide to look at the vision, the mission, the objectives, the value system of that company, the organizational structure, corporate and otherwise. And there may be a change of ownership. If I, Momo, was to buy into a company, I bring my own ideas and my own vision, and I may decide that certain parts of that company I don't want to have any business with. And last again, but not the least, is the change of technology. Things are changing rapidly. Technologically, you may find that you have no option but then to say, look, let me leave, because I'm not in this game anymore. And there's an abundance of such examples all over the world. So who are the major players in Nigeria? The international oil companies, who have been here for many, many years. Indigenous oil companies operating mid-sized fields. Marginal field operators. I heard Benga talk about marginal fields. I personally hate that word now, because at this stage, we should not be talking of marginal fields. We should have progressed beyond that to mid-sized fields. You start by being marginal, and you should be growing as you go along. Oh, okay. So you should put your slides number, I think we're now number 4. Okay, slide number 4, please. Anyway, so okay, next one. Next one. Thank you. When I joined the industry a few eons ago, this was the picture we had. Big players virtually all over the Niger Delta. Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron. Hardly any indigenous players on the scene. And therefore, it's next one, please. I think this is the picture people had in the back of their mind when, next slide, please. When this so-called breaking news happened in the middle of this year, where an announcement would say that Shell will be divesting of its remaining land and swamp assets and offshore, shallow offshore assets. But the question is really, was this breaking news? It wasn't. Shell and other IOCs over the years had sold off some of their assets to a number of indigenous operators, some of whom are here in this room. The strategy then was based on a need to reduce its footprint in the land and swamp terrain of the Niger Delta. And for Shell, that process started many years ago. And indeed, the train had already left the station before middle of this year. And for some reason never drew attention until when that announcement was made. Oops, we're all going to leave the land, terrain, and shallow offshore. The strategy which Shell had then was to say, look, we want to reduce our footprint. But it now appears as if they're going to remove that footprint completely from land, swamp, and shallow offshore. Next slide, please. I then, when I looked at, I made this presentation, ladies and gentlemen, about 2 weeks ago to the CPI, and I went and looked at some of the transactions that have taken place over the last 20 years. Next one, please. Next one. Next one. Yeah. So these are examples of what has happened in the past. Owando, Saplat, FHN, 2010, 2011. Owando and Konoko Phillips. Sorry, before them was my good friend here, Imo Itsueli, who was a trailblazer. He bought over a company many, many years ago before even these companies came into place. So Imo, sorry I didn't list you on this transaction. But he was there from the very beginning. So indeed, this journey had started long before this announcement was made. And what we're about to see in the next few years, or what we have been seeing, is a change of landscape over the last few years. Next one, please. So, I got this chat from my friends in the indigenous players just 2 days ago. And what you can see is that from 2010 to where we are now, virtually all the fields in the land swamp and shallow offshore will be held by indigenous players. I say will be held. This is the picture that has been painted by the indigenous players on the assumption that assets will go to indigenous players, which is not what Shell said. It just said we want to divest. But if that takes place, then indeed you will see that that picture will be as it is now. And what has happened is over these years, close to 11 billion of divestments taken place. 11 billion. And for those who bought these assets, I'm told they have spent a collective of 13 billion on these assets to grow production from virtually zero to about 150, 200,000 barrels per day as we are today. So, what drove the exit plans? Next one, please. First of all, inability to extract full value from existing assets. Inability of the joint venture partners to fully fund the JV. International pressure from shareholders, stakeholders, activists, etc., on international companies on how they were behaving or misbehaving in Nigeria. Security issues in the Niger Delta. Crude theft. I've been told that some people produce 100 barrels, put it in the pipeline, they'll be lucky to get 60 at the other end of the pipeline. What happens to it? Maybe Lai will tell us. He knows better. I don't know. I'm not in the oil business now, so I don't count it anymore. But I hear that
something happens and that crew never gets to the terminal. Many of these companies have faced numerous litigations, many litigations. There have been local pressures from various sources. And more recently, the whole issue of transition from fossil fuel to renewables and COVID-19 really put the nail on the coffin, and the guy said, well, we have had enough. On external pressures, I saw a very interesting article, I believe in March or April. A certain Mr. Blessed Joff of the Church Commissioners of England, who manages the Church of England's investment, said, today was a stark warning for big oil, with executives being held to account by investors and lawmakers. If you recall, ExxonMobil lost at least 2 board seats to an activist hedge fund. Shareholders of Chevron endorsed a call to further reduce its emissions. And a court in Holland deemed Royal Dutch's emission targets insufficient. So, with that background, why should there be a concern about IOC's diversity? First, I think there's a fear that the herd mentality will kick in. And when I started this presentation, I didn't even realize that herd mentality had already kicked in. Because I understand one of the IOCs was quietly doing its own divestment without any announcements. There's a fear that could be a negative economic impact in some oil-producing areas. If you go to at least one of the centers in the Niger Delta where there was a major divestment, you have offices that have been left unoccupied, housing that have been abandoned, medical facilities that have been abandoned, and of course there's fear whether this whole thing may not just occur. There's also worry that there could be a focus on the short term by buyers of assets as they recoup their purchase prices. There's also a concern that by divesting, the national income of oil might reduce because less taxes are being paid by whoever buys these assets. There's also a potential reduction in long-range activities like training, exploration. I mentioned training because some of us are what we are because the IOC has invested a lot of money in training. Not only training us, but training people like NNPC and DPR, but also training us together. Some of my best friends and colleagues in DPR and NNPC are people whom I attended the same courses with. What does that mean? It meant that if we are sitting across a table and having a discussion, I could look them eyeball to eyeball and say, you're talking rubbish, without offending him, because we knew each other. We knew ourselves on a personal level. I'm not sure that is taking place now and what the consequences will be for the future. There will be absence of international pressure. Parent companies, media, shareholder governments may just not be there. And what will that be? It will then lull our local players to play to local rules. We may be less demanding and discerning. And I'll give you an example. When I made this presentation to the CPI, I told them that not many people knew that when I was a GM in the East, each and every fatality that took place under me, I had to personally take that report to the directors in Holland, to tell them what had happened, tell them what I was going to do about that situation. I can tell you, I enjoyed going to Europe, but those trips are not trips I enjoyed going on. Because there's a lot of pressure on you to deliver. That pressure to deliver, helps to raise the quality of your delivery. So I'm not saying anything wrong with local rules. Local rules can be tight, but if you're only playing to local rules, you may find that it may be tough. There could be a reduction, lack of new investments. People who have spent a lot of money, some people, not all of them, some people who have spent a lot of money buying these assets may not then be willing to spend a lot of money investing. So they will suck and suck and suck. It's like having a savings account, so you just withdraw and withdraw and withdraw. At some stage, that saving account will deplete. Your reserves will not deliver, and then you will have issues related to production and OPEC quota. And I found it very interesting that the This Day article in October actually alluded to this, whereby Nigeria was pleading that OPEC should increase its quota. When OPEC turned around and said, oh boy, you haven't even produced the one we gave to you, because of lack of, part of it, lack of investment, thieving that goes on, and as we go along. So, as a country, we must strive to maintain our capacity to maximize the value of production. And sometimes you hear people talk about price of oil and forget about, it's not the price of oil, it's the value of what you get for your asset. It has to be simple arithmetic, volume times price. And at this stage now where the price is high, we should be out there close to our capacity, producing as much as we can. Okay, so let me talk about potential positive results of divestment. I believe that if divestments go into the hands of the right persons, they will work those assets aggressively, as has been demonstrated by some companies. They will offer employment opportunities. It can lead to an expansion of contractor base, which also will lead to an increase in local content. I also believe that it will also lead to lower costs, as local companies will not have to bear the burden of an international home office. And I believe also that indigenous local companies will be able to solve community issues more readily and more quickly. I believe also that, as we have seen, and some companies have done, focusing on gas development, whereby I believe 30–40% of all the gas that's being consumed in Nigeria now comes from the local companies. So, chat doesn't actually show this, but I have examples of companies that have grown or stabilized production. And when I looked at them, I think the number of 3 things stood out. One is the injection of new investment. 2 was the owners were professionals who knew the business. 3, strong governance. So let's look at the negative sides. One is what I mentioned earlier on, focusing on short-term gains. I have bought this asset for so long, for so much, I need to get my money back. Forgetting that we are dealing with a depleting asset. Exploration will suffer. I don't know how much exploration we have done in the last 5–6 years, whether it is seismic acquisition or whether exploration wells. Training may not receive attention. See, cost of operations may go up. On the other side, I said that they won't bear the cost of the international, but cost of operations will go up. Because if you got to source your money locally, it ain't cheap. But I'm not looking at you, but you know the banking sector, it ain't cheap. It ain't cheap in Nigeria to raise money, if you even get the money. It's not cheap. There will be a lack of international pressure, which could result in not caring about what the world thinks about us. There could be a temptation to cut corners, to play by local rules. The other thing that worries me that if you have so many of these small companies operating, and meanwhile you have the equivalent of DPR or the agency, the one company that's actually supervising, are they increasing their capacity, whether it's manpower or... Are are they going to be able to actually manage and supervise these companies? It's a challenge. So, the presentation we also looked at some companies that have not grown their assets, made no new investments. Owners tended not to be professionals and had weak governance. So, in conclusion, divestments are a normal part of conducting business. IOCs have been divesting both locally and internationally. Such activities of divestment can result in new opportunities. However, there are a number of potential downsides. We have to be able to take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the downsides. How we regulate these new players, these additional players, large number of small players, is something we need to keep an eye on. We must try and see how these assets will go into the hands of those who can manage them. Not that they are imposed or the way we do things, whereby somebody who doesn't even know what an oil field looks like gets to buy those assets. Lastly, but not the least, as a country that's heavily dependent on the revenues, at least the forex of oil business, we must watch closely how much we are getting from these operations or these new operators so that people don't cut corners and avoid paying taxes when due. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Imama, for those very insightful words. Although I have to say that I don't think insightful quite cuts it when we're talking about what we've just listened to. You know, as a lawyer, I've always been taught that experience is paramount. And I don't think any of us can deny the wealth of experience that was just shared with us. You know, in the short few minutes that Mr. Imama was speaking with us, he took us through the history of divestments right from 1970s till today. He shared a few nuggets of wisdom for the indigenous players, and I certainly hope that they've been paying attention and will rise to the challenges that he discussed. And I think that really does take us into our next speaker, Mr. Bita Adeniji. Mr. Adeniji is a specialist energy and natural resources lawyer, probably known to many in this room because he's been part of policy making in the Nigerian petroleum landscape. Between 2015 and 2018, he was Senior Technical Advisor, Upstream and Gas Policy Regulation to the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, and he led the preparation of the National Gas Policy, the National Petroleum Policy, and has worked on the various bills over the years that eventually culminated in the PIA. Certainly, it'll be a pleasure to get his perspective on the legislative framework in which these divestments now have to play out. I should mention that Mr. Adeniji is joining us virtually because he's in some remote part of Africa where I can only assume that there must be some oil or some gas for him to be there right now. But I will say that his partner, Jumoke Fajamirokin, is with us as well. So if we do, for any reason, have technical difficulties with his presentation, she will be able to step in. So without further ado, let's please have Mr. Adeniji. Thank you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for allowing me into the room, inviting me to this gathering of very distinguished members of the industry today. I'm very sorry indeed not to be with you physically. When the mayor spoke to me about a month ago about this event, I was certain I'll be in Lagos. But unfortunately,
Recording in progress.
National DC4, which is national currently, right there in Malabo. And Malabo is not so remote, actually, very nice, very interesting place, actually. But well, here I am. So please accept my apologies for not being with you physically. I would like to talk this evening more about divestments. All of us within the context of gay, I speak with the gay and all that, but I'm a little bit unsettled about the issue of the divestments. I thought I should just talk a little bit more about that this evening than to segue to the gay. So my talk really, let's title it of canaries, dogs, rodents, snakes and ladders. So just imagine, those animals, the animal kingdom now. Canaries, dogs, rodents, snakes and ladders. So those dogs, we are right now seeing tectonic shifts in the global energy sector with industrialized nations, international banks, multilateral institutions, and IOCs, all converging, coordinating their policies towards the reduction of investment in carbon-intensive fuels. This is the so-called energy transition, which is designed to move the world to a carbon-free and net-zero environment. And that's good, to some extent, but it also has a downside. But that's the reality confronting us today. We should all be reminded by these coordinated policy positions of how, in the days of yore, miners in underground mines were warned by the distress of canaries that gas levels were rising too high on the ground, which would allow the miners to escape to safety. Here's the expression, canaries in the coal mine. This is what is an expression we use to indicate danger. Similarly, the last dogs barking or howling or rodents fleeing from underground abodes ahead of earthquakes. Discerning human beings will take heed of these warning signs from the canaries, dogs, and rodents. So I'm speaking in parables. So let's take it home. To the credit of the Nigerian government, it warned itself in its sector policies in 2017 of an oncoming post-oil era that will be characterized by potential decline in demand for crude oil. And it made several commitments in the sector policies. And those commitments suggest a certain level of understanding about the potential adverse impacts of the energy transition on Nigeria. So government followed through with this understanding with the Petroleum Industry Act, which it has promoted as a blueprint to reshape the petroleum sector towards unprecedented investment to lay the foundation for a new industrial economy on the back of the country's abundant crude oil and natural gas resources. But we must wonder why, after lobbying so hard and consistently over the last almost 20 years for the modernization of Nigeria's petroleum laws and its governance framework, Shell took a decision to divest all but a few assets in its portfolio in Nigeria. And why Chevron is also divesting some of its assets. And not forgetting ExxonMobil, which is reportedly looking for a way to significantly minimize its footprint in Nigeria. This is Nigeria's main partners in the petroleum industry. And going by the provisions of the PIA, this divestment will almost certainly occur. As when you look at the PIA, not much has materially changed, but will the procedure for divestment. Say for the department that any application for consent must comply with the requirements of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act. That's all. But when British Gas, or BG, left Nigeria a few years ago, followed by Conoco, well, not many were concerned. It's just that's another transaction. And also when the ad hoc transactions, sales made by Shell happened a few years ago, well, we weren't too concerned about it. But when you have Nigeria's long-term partners organizing large-scale asset divestments, at a time when the president's ink is hardly dry on the landmark legislation that is meant to radically transform the industry, we must ask ourselves, why the Canaries are in flight, heading for the hills, to the safety of the offshore areas, or to safer harbor? It's a big question. It doesn't help that Nigeria's political risks are arguably at the highest since the Civil War. And whilst some of us whisper or walk around on eggshells around this elephant in the room, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy magazine, The Economist, Financial Times, and a number of other global publications and think tanks are loud-hailing the reality of our structural fissures in Nigeria. So rather than ignoring these canaries in agitation, surely we should take a closer look at these high-profile exits and begin to understand the implications for upstream funding, for oil production, for hydrocarbon revenues, and for Nigeria's overall political economy. This is a big deal. It is not a normal event. So what are these companies seeing that we are missing? What is the Nigerian government still wrong? Is the PIA that unattractive to keep our partners in? Or are the RSCs signaling a strong potential for long-term disruptions to carbon production? Or are we just dealing with just merely energy transition-driven assets rationalization without more? These are very important questions. And I thank Mr. Momo for teasing us of these issues, but I do believe that there are deeper level issues here that we need to look at. Or perhaps even the incoming issue, the issue of Nigeria's embarrassing failure through 4 administrations to enact legislation to reform the industry towards a more sustainable path. Well, no thanks to the snakes, those malevolent characters, the shadowy tycoons in the oil companies, in the public service, in our legislature, and others in high office who ambushed progressive reforms over the years. In the end, Nigeria's opportunity dropped down the ladder of progress through tactical block by the snakes. And those billions of critically important investment dollars was lost to other countries. The outcome confronting Nigeria is deindustrialization, an unsustainable PMS subsidy, the absence of a refining and petrochemical sector, basically waste during our years of opportunity, almost like not making hay whilst our sun was shining. And now we find that the world is not going to wash with oil, but it's moving away from oil. Just like our partners are moving away from our oil. We should be concerned. Now, on sector governance, to the extent that sector misgovernance had a lot to do with this green picture, it's important that we try to understand what the government is putting on the table through the PIA during the energy transition to address this issue. That understanding might help us better appreciate why the PIA might not be such a compelling proposition to some of Nigeria's upstream partners. My submission in this regard is that Nigeria's desire to broaden the economy away from oil towards a gas-based industrial economy and into refining and petrochemicals requires disciplined and competent sector governance in a manner that aligns all players towards these goals and towards an effective management of the sector. Now, if we take our experience during the post-military era, that experience informs us that the office of the Minister of Petroleum Resources is inadequately resourced with the technical skills and capacity for policy making and sector supervision. But if you look at the PIA, you find that it unfortunately misses the opportunity to address this very significant institutional capacity issue. Therefore, we should expect a continued absence of an engine room for deep policy thinking and effective sector supervision. Now, why is this due? You're going to transition. You're coming into late petroleum legislation. And you must have the ability to supervise the sector towards your policy objectives, your economic policy objectives. With that depth in that office, then it may be difficult. And let me illustrate. Two regulators are created by the Act. These regulators have significantly stronger powers than their predecessor agencies. Now, with limited powers for the minister and more muscular regulatory agencies created, one has to wonder how effective the minister will be in supervising and keeping tenured regulators on track with respect to critical economic policy goals coming out of the petroleum sector. It's a big issue. Now let us add to that mix a dual or bifurcated model adopted for regulation of the industry going forward, and the respective powers granted to each agency over technical, economic, and environmental regulation. This bifurcated design, again, was an opportunity loss, as operators have to relate with two powerful agencies with respect to their projects, and these have grave implications for cost, for time, which Nigeria doesn't have, and for efficiency. These implications will be visited not just on investors, but on consumers and the nation. Now, moving forward, let's look at the NNPC. It is required, the NNPC Limited rather, is required by the PIA to seek funding from sources other than public funds, which makes sense, given that this is a mature industry that should ordinarily be able to attract investment. Ordinarily, let's say. Now, some of the required funding of NNPC share of auction costs would ordinarily have been provided by its partners. But with these partners seeking to divest from the joint ventures, our fiscal authorities need to be alive to the potential. IJB and IJB, because that's a voluntary issue in any event. so they may not happen. The potential that many projects will be suspended onto the current cloud around the proposed divestments are resolved. The implications for the Treasury are obvious. The larger question is how NMC Limited is positioned over the long term to raise funds for a share of joint venture operations, given the stance of the global financial institutions to fossil fuels. We should expect increasing difficulty around this issue in the coming years. Again, there will be treasury impacts should this prospect become real. But it's not all good, because there is a silver lining. Fortunately, Nigeria's gas resources are abundant, and there is a high level of interest in natural gas as a transition fuel. For Nigeria, its long-term objective must be industrial projects, and of course, gas supply to the power sector. Now, this objective present a regulatory system and all of the gas assets, some of whom are in the room as I speak, with opportunity to rise to the challenges that are already raised and to move as quickly as possible into gas monetization projects. However, some important adjustments to the PIA are necessary if the vision for gas-based industrialization is to be achieved. To be specific, the gas pricing provisions in the Act need to be urgently addressed, as well as the missing fiscal incentives for virtual gas pipeline projects. This improvement will help address gas demand and energy penetration in many underserved markets in the country. Now, as for gas supply to the power sector, much more work is required to debottleneck the power sector before viable investments can be made for gas supply to that currently illiquid sector, unfortunately. So, to conclude, I was never going to review the PIA over dinner tonight. Otherwise, we'll be here till tomorrow. I think Big has done a pretty good job around that this evening. And I know that there are many grandchildren waiting for many people tonight to return home for a leg rub. I just thought that it was important that I tease out some salient truths around what we've done to ourselves as a people, and to share some thoughts around what we need to urgently do to attend to during this new era in order to better position the country not only out of danger, but into opportunity, because opportunity is knocking at Nigeria's door. What is clear that all is not well, and our canaries are agitated, and our time is not on Nigeria's favor, but all hands must be on deck. May I therefore take this opportunity to remind the captains of the oil industry present tonight, and the boarding ones, of course, that there is a direct correlation between country and petroleum sector management and the outcome of your investments. And I know that your ethos in the Petroleum Club is not to get involved with politics. I'm not asking you to run for politics, run for offices. But as a group of persons likely to be directly affected by the quality of the management of the petroleum sector and broadly of the nation going forward, this issue must be even more important for you as we enter a new era in the global energy industry. The PIA is down, but it is not the finished article that we all wanted and many worked for over that 20-year period. If I may be impertinent, may I respectfully seek your attention to engage with government as a body of very influential and vested people, not only in industry but in the Nigerian economy, for an urgent attention and redress to this issue. The issue of the missing bits, the gaps in the PIA, and the unclear provisions, which would help to better position the industry towards investment that government requires. So I will close by thanking you for giving the opportunity to speak to you tonight, all the way from Malabo. And I look forward to seeing you all whenever I get back to Lagos. And I hope that the rest of the deliberations go well tonight. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adenuji. Of canaries, dogs, snakes, and ladders. You had some sober words there, I think, but all very thought-provoking. And I think that what Mr. Adenuji's presentation is that he's actually put in sharp focus some of these deep practicalities that are involved in implementing the PIA in the current climate, in this jurisdiction, and most especially at a time of these divestments. You know, he asks, why are the canaries fleeing? Why are they in flight? It actually echoed some of the sentiments that we heard from our first panelist, Mr. Imomo. He asked, why are these divestments happening at this time? And it's something that we all in this industry need to take into account, because it then puts into context how it is that the indigenous players will actually be able to take advantage of those more of the PIA. And now we move on to our third speaker, Dr. Herbert Wigwe. At this point, actually, I need to make a confession, right? So I was introduced as a lawyer, a partner at Templars, but the confession is that I'm actually a finance lawyer, and my corner of the petroleum industry is actually advising on financing transactions. So having advised on some of the biggest financing transactions of acquisitions, you know, and similar transactions in the industry recently, I'm actually very excited for our next speaker. That's not to play favorites. It's just that, like everybody else in this room, funding is always key. You can have a deal, but without the funding, it's not going anywhere, right? And I think we all know that. And because of that, it means that when we have Dr. Herbert Wigwe, if I can just segue into a little bit of his bio, he's CEO and Group MD of Access Bank PLC. He's had a career in financial services that spans more than 27 years, including over 12 years as the DMD and eventually the CEO of Access Bank. Access Bank is now a digitally led Tier 1 franchise spanning 3 continents and 12 countries with 42 million customers. It has 28,000 staff across more than 600 branches and operates 3,100 ATMs and 32,000 POS terminals. Those are details. I think one of the most interesting details in Dr. Wigwe's bio, as many of us will know, is that in 2002, himself and his business partner, Aigoje Aikemokwede, saw a unique opportunity and acquiring a small commercial bank, at the time, the 65th largest of the 89 banks in the country. It's no mean feat that Access Bank is where it is today. And it's also no coincidence that Access Bank has been involved in several of the significant financings in this industry. It therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wigwe, and maybe he can tell us the secret to bankable projects in the era of the PIA. Dr. Wigwe.
Thanks, Zelda. Good evening, very, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen.
we know that about 80% of our export earnings comes from the oil and gas industry. So I can just approximate that in this room, as I look on the right and see Mike, and I see some great industry players, I'm sure that we can still find 60% inside here. So I'm not going to take so much of your time because it's too expensive a time to take, particularly as I stand between you and dinner. But I'll be speaking to the funding options for acquisition of the IOC divestment oil assets, more specifically the role of banks and Nigerian banks, I would imagine. And to carry out my presentation, I'll be looking at the following outline. I'll look at the oil industry, the highlights, look at the emerging trends, the indigenous participation and IOC investments. I'll speak to some of the issues that I've gotten some of my colleagues and how they've recovered and how they intend supporting some of the industry participants as we go into the future. We'll look at the role of banks generally, look at the funding options, and then just a little bit about access. We move to the next slide, which is slide 2, and we look at the recent oil and gas industry highlights. A couple of things that have happened in the sector. We have the major project FIDs, what has happened in NLNG Train 7, very interesting landmark transaction, Bonga Southwest, NNPC project. Some of these projects that were held down by the non-passage of the FIB. Interestingly, there appears to be some increase in rig count, which would indicate the fact that there appears to be increased activity. Baker Hughes recorded increased number of rigs from 13 in May to 29 September 2021. Again, OPEC and production cuts. We've seen oil prices go up to about $70 a barrel in the last 6 months. I don't know if it's sustainable. I hear that forecasts at the price deck level at about $60 levels. These things are interesting to read and see. However, you hope that you don't have another coronavirus or some stupid thing that happens that lead to oil price crashing to very low levels. The PIA is passed. What that means is for us to know, is for us to find out about implementation. And of course, the real issue today is around the IOC asset divestments, acquisition and marginal bid rounds, etc. I think, just as Mr. Momo said, divestments are part of life and are here to stay. Initially, they spoke about reducing footprints. Now they're actually taking away the footprints completely. When local players buy, we do hope that at some point, when they find out that these things are not as profitable as they intended, they will act in the same manner and all of that. But let's look at the history and the emerging trends. You will forgive us if we don't capture this in an elegant a manner as you would want it to be. We have one of the trailblazers, perhaps, the gentleman who actually started all of this, Mr. Imoisweli, who's here, purchased his assets, I think it was in 1986, if I recall, sir. 87, Dubri. Great start, and it gave impetus to a lot of players in the industry. Just slightly before that, obviously, you had Panocean, and that was in the discretional allocation era. Right after that, we moved into the presidential award era, whatever that means. So we had a lot of people given oil fields. We had OPL 135, we had Pampa Oil, Seagull, OPL 467, Oriental Energy. And of course, at this time, the whole idea was to get more and more indigenous participation, all right, in the market. And that went on, I think, till 1998. And then we have another era which was referred to as the marginal field era. I can see Uju looking at me. That was when her own came out properly, written at you. We had Network Oil and Gas. We had Malabo Oil, NDPR, which did exceedingly well and is still doing well. We had Amni, Peak. And, in this marginal field era, we've seen some success. We've also seen those who have not done too well and we'll speak to some of the issues as we move on. And again, in 2007, we had the PSC bid round, and of course, you had the likes of Sahara, Oando, and Energy. Then the big divestments came, and that started in 2010, and the big divestments coming from Shell and Chevron, we had Seplat, Mr. Austin Aburu, I think I saw him earlier here, making his play, Elcrest, Nekonde, ND Western, of course you have the likes of ITO, New Cross, and Eroton. Now there were several reasons obviously that fueled the divestment, several. And I think Mr. Imoma has spoken to them. Huge security issues, profitability, of course the growing energy transition. I was speaking to the global CEO of Total, who now refers to Total as Total Energies, and speaking to the transition as far as oil and gas is concerned. So all of those things, different institutions are creating different landmarks as far as how they want to basically transition into into cleaner fuel, if you like. You also have government policies and business environment. Let's not take it for granted. People's capacity to stay in this country, not a joke. And of course, there are issues around improved technology making deep water a bit more attractive. Speaking to the role of banks, you may criticize Nigerian banks. All you have to do is to go across the continent and see how local banks support large transactions, whether it's in mining or in oil and gas, etc. And I think there are only two real countries you can see deep support, perhaps, and I'm talking with respect to mining, from the local banks, where they have capacity. You'll probably find it in South Africa, and you'll see it in Nigeria. Now, if you look at all of this, the Nigerian banks today have about $10 billion in terms of exposure to the sector. This does not include exposure from oil traders who are doing different types of deals to support people. But the reality is simple. Once you have the Nigerian banks supporting you, most times you find a lot of foreign banks piggybacking on that and coming to provide additional funding. Because the view is that if your local banks do not support you, why should we, who are all the way in Europe or America, come and support you? So they typically would come in on the back of what you're seeing some of the local banks doing. Obviously, there will be collaborations. The local banks will normally team up with several other institutions across the world that they have relationships with, and of course, international development financial institutions to provide funding. As you move on in that ladder, there will be asset acquisition. It starts getting a bit more technical, where people lend against reserves, and of course, start taking longer-term facilities. Now, again, you would agree with me that the dollar is not the principal currency of our country, and so the longer you go out as far as the tenor is concerned, 7 years, 10 years, the local banks start becoming a bit shy. And that is because when you look at the maturity matches in terms of foreign currency funding on the balance sheet of the banks, even from a conservative standpoint, or your regulatory limits will start to become a bit more stringent. If you look at total funding support today, like I said, you will see about $10 billion over the past couple of years. And of course, I think $7 billion have come directly from their balance sheet. Now, obviously, you have other sources of funding. You have commodity traders who are doing short-term deals or medium-term deals, who are basically taking security by way of products that you are producing. They typically would come after you have started producing, these traders. And you can't blame them. I mean, because, Benjamin, I'm not speaking to you. They come at the short end of the whole thing, and claim to be providing you longer-term funding. Meanwhile, you're giving them food, on a monthly basis. But that is how they've chosen to play. Whether we like to believe it or not, it's still part of providing funding for the overall market. Let's quickly speak to the funding options. Obviously, the preferred source of funding that most bankers will speak to will be people raising equity. There will be an appropriate leverage ratio, if you like. And so there will be equity, which is straight equity, or you could have done a rights issue, or you could have done a private placement, and all of that. But again, the market is so deep, it's so shallow, that except for the large institutions that have built up significant reserves over time, the locals will be struggling. And again, that is one of the big issues because once you're over leveraged, it also comes with its own consequences. As that is done, you now have convertible debt, which is possible. But again, depending on the institution and how sophisticated the founders may be, all right, some people start getting into very deep discussions around shares dilution. But I think people are getting better and knowing that 10% of a massive institution is better than 100% of zero. But it has always been a challenge when you speak to some Nigerian investors or some Nigerian entrepreneurs in this sector, and just offering them convertible finance. Right after that, obviously, in the hierarchy, you have project finance loans. These will typically come after you've raised enough capital, and then, of course, perhaps convertible debt. You then start having the real project finance loans. These are the real things that start pushing the whole thing. And for most Nigerian investors, this is where it typically stops, or most Nigerian oil entrepreneurs, because to go into things like corporate bonds, again, you need to start rating the institutions and all of that, and most people don't do that well. Several syndicated lending facilities have come in over the past couple of years, some of which we have participated in. But I think the top 5 Nigerian banks have had significant exposure to this market. A lot of it good, but I think given the crisis that happened in the last couple of years, people had their fingers burnt. This was when you had a significant crash in oil prices, particularly to institutions that did basically carry out a hedge in terms of making sure that there was a price hedge. So it's made people a bit shy, but I think there's been significant learnings that have come out of that. And as we move into this new era of divestments for the better quality names, you will see some funding begin to come out. From an Access Bank standpoint, we wouldn't do a transaction except we can see it all the way through to the end. And so we provide the complete bouquet of services from a financial advisory standpoint, and then of course we'll put our mouth where our money where our mouth is. So in several of the cases that you see, there has been funding as far as the asset acquisition is concerned. But in doing that, all right, we have sought to look at all sorts of risk sharing and co-financing structures that will ensure that it's not just about buying those assets, it's about supporting them in their drilling campaigns and all of that to ensure that there is increased production and all. So again, we provide them with structured funding and all that. But it gets a lot easier after the asset has been acquired. But it is important that you see it all the way through rather than just saying, okay, we've just bought this asset, and then what do we need to do next? To raise money to start funding or project finance, it gets a bit more difficult. You have to put everything in place to make sure that whatever you're doing is clear from the very beginning. So obviously, there will be very technical lending around reserve-based lending. It is very technical. Again, there are specialized people who deal in that field who have worked with us in the past. Of course, you also have corporate term facilities, mezzanine finance, and in several cases, we've had to partner with some of the development finance institutions who have worked with us over time. What do banks typically look for? For most people here, I'm sure you've accessed funding several times, but I'll just share with you quickly. At least in the context of Nigeria, you will normally have your traditional valuation, all the things that need to be done with respect to your reserves, your P1 or your P2 reserves to find out how producible your field is. So they would look at your reserves potential, significant due diligence to basically identify the crown jewels. Location is important. They say the choice fields are best located in less than 25 meters water depth. Issues around evacuation of the products is important. I think when Mr. Emomo was doing his presentation, he didn't want to call it the exact words around the amount of leakages that happen before you take your product. You drill for 100 and you take 60 home. You see about 20 different attachments to the pipeline. It's a shame because we need to deal with it. And when you go to Port Harcourt today, you see all sorts of things happening. You have oil refining. People are taking crude from, and this is stolen crude, all right, and they're refining. Or you go internationally, and people are selling stolen. I mean, Why those things happen, we don't know. But it all comes from this leakage that we see. But what is more important, apart from the leakage, is the fact that there is significant security issues around it, depending on the location. Security issues around the community, security issues around life, and all. So those are some of the big issues people have to deal with, and banks have to take into consideration before they lend money. What are you going to do to a customer who was kept away from carrying his products for 180 days? He didn't steal, he didn't do anything wrong. So location is important, and of course the evacuation route. There is the economic viability, which is tied to it, community issues, and of course, I would add the issue around hedging policy. For most of the unsophisticated players in the past, they want to keep an open position. Oh, oil prices are currently at $70 per barrel. I'd rather keep it there. You don't even know that tomorrow that price can be $20 per barrel. But again, for some of us, that hedging is extremely important, and determining the hedge price is critical to ensure that at the end of the day, you are or the institution remains profitable. Speaking to ourselves, and the challenges for indigenous players, the first is funding. You must have some equity before you are lent money. No bank is going to lend you money 100% because you have found you have huge amount of reserves. It's the first rule around failing as a lender. You find some of them who have very limited history, and of course the fact that, of course, there's significant mismatching in terms of funding from the bank. The technical capacity is also a problem, but I think the most important is around governance. People do these things sometimes on a big ego trip, and they do this and they don't have, particularly in the mid-level, you don't find the right construct as far as governance is concerned to support the level of leverage that they are going to be taking and the planning required. And so that is a big issue. And so even in these divestments, there may be good deals. You may find some of the assets still worth it, but once governance is lacking in anything, and any business for that matter, it becomes a big issue. Not to talk of when you're going to find them asking for significant amount of money in terms of dollar loans. We already spoke about the fluctuating crude prices and the volatility in the markets and the need for hedge instruments to protect all of them. So these are some of the big issues and challenges that our indigenous players actually face. There are also issues for people who are not indigenous players. For the IOCs, it's not a problem because all of these things are in place. But for any first-time comer to this market, more specifically around the indigenous players, it is a big deal. For the banks, it gets a bit more tricky. Following the last crisis that happened, our regulators have introduced even more stringent ways of looking at our portfolios. So we now have we now have significant sectoral limits or constraints, obligor limits, minimum collateral requirements, even for oil and gas. You know, for business people, you can come and say, oh my God, can I give property to borrow 100 or $1 billion? What type of property is that? But the reality is that our regulators are insisting on different types of security, not just physical security, but they're getting more and more concerned about the nature of security people take. But forget our regulators. Basel III has introduced new constraints that none of you can possibly imagine with respect to lending, particularly, all right, depending on the sector you are lending to, and something we refer to as economic dependence and all of that. It's beginning to become an issue. Cost of funds is a big issue, and I think Mr. Emomo spoke to it. The price of cost of borrowing in Nigeria is significant. The dollar is not our principal currency. The price of dollar can only be tied to your country's risk rating, which also adds a premium, and so it makes it certainly much more expensive than borrowing, overseas and all of that. And so it makes, when you're computing your NPV and all of that, it is an issue. Again, there is a problem with the structure and the amount of, in terms of timing. For some of these assets, you need real long-term money. for them to really become profitable, sometimes that could take you as long as 10 years. Because dollar is not our principal currency, sometimes even if you issue corporate bonds, what you tend to see is you get tenors of about 5 years, 7 years, etc. Once you start getting beyond that kind of tenor, most Nigerian banks start getting shy of lending. So that is a big issue that the Nigerian banks face. For the larger banks, in the top 5, there will be some gapping, so they can accommodate it. But even at that, there would have to be portfolio constraints for us to continue to support you. Again, technical skills gap. People would rather lend to easier sectors than lend to the oil and gas industry. And so the only names they will tend to want to lend to in the oil and gas industry would be the more stable names, would be the stronger names, who already have source, for dollars. But on the average, banks would tell themselves, why do I want to take this risk for a local operator and run into problems very quickly? I'd rather give it to the IOC where there's good governance, where you can take, you are rest assured that you'll get your money back on time. So these are some of the issues. However, if you stick to the larger banks, you will find some respite and people who will be willing to look at it, even for what it means to the overall country. And finally, bankability of the assets. We already spoke to issues around location and evacuation. We do hope that most of the deals don't become an ego trip, because sometimes they truly are, and we see them every day. If it is not worth your while, or you're cutting it too finely at the edge in terms of the pricing of what you want to do, you will see a lot of banks basically run away from you, or we just get scared that if this thing goes bust, it would affect them. And when you give a dollar loan as a bank, the implication of that loan going bad is so different from when you give a naira facility, because you have a huge currency risk and you're in a country where you have significant devaluation. So you could have started with a loan of $100 million at a time when exchange rates were, 300 naira to the dollar, so it would have been a 300 billion naira facility. And then there's a devaluation. It gets to 500. That singular act changes that loan amount, and it doesn't end there. Until that money is repaid, you continue to face the vagaries of that devaluation. So when you see banks running away from long-term assets considered a bit more risky, particularly in foreign currency, you have to understand the reason they're doing it. However, if you have your act intact, all right, and you have the right partners, and you have the right governance structure, chances are that you can get some money, because some of us continue to finance some of the leading names in the sector. What are we looking for? Capacity is important. The right funding structure is important. You must have equity. You must have an entrepreneurial mindset, because sometimes you run into very, very murky waters in Nigeria. You must find a way to solve those problems in terms of moving out your product and all of that, dealing with the community pragmatically. All of those things are very, very, very important. I don't know if you've ever had to negotiate with people in Bayelsa. If you're an oil producer. So you can sit in a living room with about 5 people. Once you are very familiar with those strategies, so one person starts discussing with you from 6 o'clock till midnight and then goes to sleep. Another one then starts discussing with you the same issue. So by the time you get to 6 a.m. in the morning, whatever they ask for, you have to just do it so that you can move on. But these are real issues and problems that we see where we come from and where all of these things exist. So, being able to deal with them and engage them constructively, all right, maintaining your ethical stance are things that are extremely important. I can't overemphasize character and experience. There's a generation of bankers that will avoid some types of people forever and ever and ever. Forever and ever. You can continue, it can go on from now till tomorrow. You do everything you want to do, the wrong person, wrong character, you've had it. And then you'll be tied down in courts forever. And there goes that money. So why would you bother about financing another one? So we have to help ourselves, actually. The more we fish out people who don't have the right reputation, the better it will be for all of us. Because it's going to affect everybody. Because my point is, why do I want to expose a syndicate to $1 billion or $2 billion, and then somebody starts telling me stories? There's no need. I might as well use it to support trade and all of that because you are destroying the foundations of our country. So these are big, big problems that we face and make us a bit reluctant to lend to the sector. So those are the critical things that we look for. I don't want to start going into details with respect to things we've done. Some of them interesting in different ways. Interesting in the context of paying back on time. Also interesting in the context of stretching it out a bit more. But on the average, we've had a good run for most of the names in spite of the problems that exist in the marketplace. A bit about Access Bank. I think Zendler said a lot about us. But I think if you cannot get funding from Access Bank, you are not a good borrower. You have to come to where we are. We have enough capacity to support the sector and to lead in most of what you want to do. We have very detailed understanding of your sector, and we have, over time, built all the relevant experience and partnerships, actually, required to basically support all of you. We actually have the presence across countries, depending on where you are and where you want to do business in the continent, whether it's in the oil and gas industry, or gas, and we can support you. Today, I think we do have the strongest bank in the UK in terms of African bank, and it says something because the UK represents a very strong financial hub to raise money. And so if you can't access money from us or from our subsidiary in the UK, we have a problem. We do have standard partners. We work with IFC, we work with JP Morgan, we work with all the large banks across the world to support institutions that basically intend to get into this sector. I don't want to stand a lot more between yourself and dinner. I want to thank you also very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wigwe. I think that was very, very interesting to hear that from the commercial banking perspective. Always very worthwhile. To Dr. Wigwe's words, I also don't want to start you and dinner. So even though there's much to dissect in his presentation, we'll have some time to do that a little bit later when we get into an interactive Q&A session. So for now, I just want to point out that very soon we'll have the ushers approaching each table, and they will lead you to the buffet in the back, and we hopefully can kick off dinner. After which, I am looking forward to an exciting interactive session. I certainly have a few questions, and I'm sure you all do too. Enjoy your dinner.
done right now. No matter where you find yourself.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I appreciate you very much in the middle of dinner, but it is getting quite late, and we're hoping that we can take just a few questions for a Q&A session, which we're hoping we can do as you wrap up your dinner this evening. So I guess I'll throw the floor open whilst we still have some of our speakers here, and if we can just take one or two questions, if there are any at all. Hello, everyone. So do we have any questions? I know that our speakers this evening more or less covered the field on all of the issues that have been coming up. We did manage to cover quite a remarkable amount of ground this evening, but we're hoping that if anyone had any questions, we could maybe address them now. Okay, on that note then, I won't disturb dinner any further. Okay, so I've actually had it suggested that I can throw the floor open. Oh, did you have a question, sir? Please. Sorry, can I ask that when you ask your question, you please let us know which of the speakers it's directed to? Thank you. Or if it's just general.
Okay. Well, my name is, I'm Professor Dio Ayoade, MNI. My question is simple, but it goes to the heart of what we've been discussing tonight. And it goes to the fact that how do we encourage government to take seriously the whole issue of energy transition? Because I think the world is leaving us behind. We spent 2 decades getting our PIA right or not, as case may be. But here we are. We have a PIA, but where is the government will to implement properly and execute properly? I say this because this evening I read something about NNPC Limited will be investing 600 billion naira odd into roads. And I asked myself, why is a new commercial company investing in roads? Thank you very much. I think if Mr. Gbite is available, I'm not sure who is available, he can answer that one. Thank you so much.
Hello, sorry for that brief interruption. It was a very, very interesting question, actually, around why. Okay, perhaps Mr. Imomo would be able to give us some insights. The question was around the NNPC investing, what was it, 600 million or so in roads? Roads, yes. I mean, exactly. You know, it's something that baffles when you think about what their mandate is. So,
I'm an oil and gas man, not a roads engineer. I don't know what their criteria is for investing on roads. I don't know. So I'm not sure I can provide you any answer. So I'm sorry, I don't know anything about roads.
thank you very much. I think maybe that's more of an in-depth. No? Oh, apologies. Okay, so we're going to have the question repeated.
The question, sorry, is about the political will of government to implement the new act. And I'm asking, why is a new company, NNPC Limited, which is established to work to make money, already involved in investment in roads as intervention? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that clarity on the question. I think we now have Mr. Adeniji remotely, so he might actually be able to give some insight on that particular point. Mr. Adeniji, see there? He's on? Okay, but we don't have... Ah, there he is. Thank you, Mr. Adeniji. I don't know if you heard the question. Okay, great.
The first is requires NNPC investing in roads, and the other is the issue of how can you get the government's attention around the energy transition. Well, also I can't speak for NNPC, but I can tell you this. You cannot presume to have enacted a commercially focused national oil company and kick off with that sort of investment.
Please, can we ask the engineers to please raise the volume? Please raise the volume for Mr. Guide so we can hear him. Can you please raise the volume slightly?
So I was just saying that you cannot presume to have kicked off a commercially focused national oil company and start investing in roads. That's not and can never be the mandate of an NOC. The origin of the concept of offsetting infrastructure costs against taxes came from the Minerals Amendment Act. And I know this because I drafted that act. And that was basically addressed towards companies engaged in mining who needed to develop infrastructure for their mines, for their businesses. Right. Now, we've now seen how all of a sudden other companies are beginning to do this. But if I just focus on NNPC Limited, that's mission driven. It doesn't even have any profits yet, it's just starting business. So what is it offsetting against? We've heard about the GMP of the corporation stating that it's looking to end up doing an IPO. These are the things you must not start doing, right? If you're really looking for money, right, from the market. You're sending wrong signals to the market for this. So it's not a good idea. Is that money appropriated? No. So there's governance issue. Straight on the right. And let's call it straight. We're all Nigerians. We must stick to this issue. But so let's put that aside. It's been said. It's not done. It's not done. On the energy transition, up with an energy transition game plan, a strategic game plan for the country that ties in multi-sectors around the issue of transition. That allows you to be able to more critically tap the opportunities that exist in transition. $130 to $150 billion will be spent on the energy transition, on new technologies, on new fuels, and all that. Nigeria must be part of that game. But it can't be part of that game if you don't have a strategy. And strategy just can't be limited to just, oh, we're reducing gas prices in the oil industry. Oh, no. No. There are point sources, right, for emission reductions in many sectors. Just as there are other opportunities in many sectors that benefit from transition. Let me take one, the mining industry. We all know that the minerals in Nigeria, some of which are energy minerals, and a lot of that $130 million will be spent on energy minerals. What's Nigeria's game plan for energy minerals? This is something that we need to look at. What's the game plan in housing? What's the game plan in transportation? So it's got to be a multi-sector approach, Dr. Ayode. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adenichi. We have another question.
Thank you very much. My name is Suleiman Raji. It looks like the energy transition is going to take decades. It's going to be a long energy transition. But I'm worried about one thing. The Western financial institutions are almost ready to stop funding for oil exploitation. And I wonder why. Because currently, there are 1.4 billion cars in the world. There are only 10 million electric cars in the world today. OPEC projections are that by 2045, only 160 million electric cars will be in the world. So it's very clear that we still continue to need oil and gas. So why are they suddenly trying to dry up upstream investment? Meanwhile, U.S. is exporting coal, the dirtiest, fuel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wigwe, perhaps you might want to venture a response. The question is, clean energy is still a long way away, so why is international funding drying up?
I guess the ESG issues that have come up in the world is such that most institutions now have to comply. And so people are asking themselves, are they going to take a long-term position of 7 years or 10 years? I think in Mr. Oyebode's presentation, he mentioned the fact that Tesla, that's what it's called, all right, now has a market valuation of 1 trillion naira. That's a car that is not even driven on the streets of Lagos. So I guess most of these foreign institutions take a long-term view. And since they are the largest providers of funding, all right, what you tend to see is that once there's a view in 10 years or 15 years that the world is moving towards clean energy, they start to dry it up gradually. If you take our own institution, we have to render quarterly reports to most of the institutions, like at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, where we issued a green bond, with respect to our compliance. Now, if we have to do it for the small amount which we took, begin to imagine what is happening to the larger international institutions that have said that they're going to comply with the ESG principles over the next 10 to 15 years. So I think that's the reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Igwe. So I guess, in summary, it's really a policy issue, right? It's a long-term policy issue. Okay. Real or not. Do we have any other questions? Yes, please.
This question is directed to Herbert Wigwe. We understand very clearly what the rest of the world is saying. But we also realize that no matter what, the pace of our development and the experiences of our reality is very divergent from the rest of the world. What steps are our local financing institutions doing to bridge that gap and to help us to sustain it? We know that the big boys, or let me not be sexist, the big people, let me not say big boys, the big persons who have the money, they control these things, they say it. You mentioned your quarterly report. You cannot exist in isolation. Nonetheless, within your own market, you are formidable, and I'm not patronizing you. And I believe that we must ask ourselves, what can we do, first of all, as a financing organization, to help us to bridge that gap and to give us a little bit more relief while we catch up? Secondly, what kind of policies do you think we should be putting in place in our energy sector that will make it bankable even in the face of that kind of buffer which you offer? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think the world is getting smaller and smaller. I think it was 2008 when we created the equivalent of the Equator Principles in Nigeria, which was the Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principles. And the whole idea was for us to basically, as an industry, all right, start to migrate towards, best practice as far as ESG principles are concerned. Now, I think the energy sector is dragging behind a little bit, because if I look at the metal fabrication sector, what we did was to start taking some of these large manufacturers and get them to, over time, all right, start converting some of the things that they're doing, all right, to ensure that they meet clean energy, that they meet clean support as far as using diesel, the carbon footprint issues, etc. If you recall, in Ikeja, there used to be some metal fabrication industries that used to flare a lot in the, during the day, all right, and it affected people and all of that. A good 80 to 90% of them have gone under, all right? Now, Lagos State implemented an act, but more importantly, the banks actually stopped lending them. Now, what we need to do in the oil and gas sector, which is a critical sector as far as Nigeria is concerned, is to bring industry participants into a room, and we all agree a process, all right, and a time period for that transition, because it's going to happen. People who are giving us money to on-lend are asking for the same standards. When we go and issue Euro bonds now, people ask, tell me your policy with respect to ESG, all right? And you have to share with them. Otherwise, you don't get the same amount of money. So whether you like to believe it or not, the whole world is following that whole trajectory. So I think right after this particular dinner, we have to come up with a structure and a process where we bring industry participants together, all right, to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with respect to the future of oil and gas? We are disadvantaged. We have a 10-year horizon, if you ask me, all right, for us to start to do that proper migration. How do we support you, all right, and make a case for you in the interim? But that's the only way for it to happen, because the world is gradually moving in that direction, and we cannot live in isolation. Thank you.
Sorry, Zelda. Thank you very much, sir. Sorry, Zelda, I have a question, because I have Dr. Lai Patana here, and I have Mr. Egbert Imomo here, and we have Mr. Ivo Sweli here. So essentially, we have a representation of what I'd call the evolution of the industry, right sitting within us here. I always tease Dr. Patana that he was talking about marginal fields when some of us did not know the difference between marginal and marginalization. And I reminded him tonight of a nice picture I had of him he's still young actually, but much younger Dr. Fatuna with his satchel, the quintessential engineer who was going about it. And they were doing things at that time. The thing I would like to challenge my chairman, and as Petroleum Club with our trustees here, is that our partnership with Access Bank must not end with dinners and events, but we must find a way to put in place a partnership where we can begin to deal with these issues and find a way out in a way that benefits the industry and benefits the nation. Because whether we like it or not, we cannot allow ourselves to be stampeded at the rate of the rest of the world. We just are not there. But we can do something in the interim. And I'm glad that sitting side by side, we have the CEO of Access and we have the chairman of the Petroleum Club. So I'm saying, son, behold your mother. Mother, behold your son. Can you please get together and begin to and let us work something that will help us. But one other question, and I must yield to my seniors here, is that you mentioned something which you didn't talk about much. There seems to be an issue of the real motive, the real underlying interest. You see, there have been a history of divestments, but it seems as if the motivations and the results over the years have changed. Why has that been? And that's a question for Mr. Ibomo. And Dr. Swelly, please, over to you, sir.
The chairman of the Petroleum Club, based on what you, I'd like to recommend and suggest a solution, a possible solution. May I recommend to Mr. Wigwe, since he's sitting on the same table with Dr. Fatono here, and of course a renowned lawyer next to him. Is it possible that under the auspices of the Petroleum Club, we initiate and inaugurate a small unofficial grouping committee? The lawyers can come up with an appropriate name, I don't mind. That will involve some Petroleum Club members. Petroleum Club will decide. Bankers, in this particular case, Access Bank. Perhaps one or two lawyers, in this case, perhaps Templars, since they are here. So that we can look at what's the best way to find out how the indigenous companies evolving. I think Egbert used the word, he didn't like it, he didn't like marginal field operators. Egbert, what did you use? You didn't like marginal field, you don't like, but you used the word medium or whatever, mid-size. Because whether we like it or not, the IOCs, Sangster has left. The IOCs are leaving. And I think it was Bitter that says it's not just a question of footprints. They've actually left. It's not reducing footprints. The footprints are no longer there. We like it or not, it's now up to us. Whether we like it or not, it's up to us. Time was. Let me digress a little bit, if you'll indulge me, Zelda. I got involved in banking in 1989-90 because I was trying to raise an LC for a crude oil. At that time, believe it or not, a barrel was $5. And the cargo, normal cargo, 1 million barrels, was $5 million. There was no Nigerian bank that could raise me an LC of $5 million. All the 5 major banks could not together, because of obligor, raise me $5 million for a cargo of crude oil. It's amazing, but that was a fact. So I thought, how do we work out a petroleum bank or banking and petroleum? That got me involved in those days with Midas Bank. So we are almost coming back to that cycle because the IOCs are leaving onshore Nigeria, shallow waters Nigeria. It's now back to Nigeria. Those banks then, mainly foreign, Barclays Bank, International Bank of West Africa, are no longer quite where they are. It's now indigenous banks. You don't use those words, just like indigenous oil companies. But it's the access of this world and the GTBs of this world that are indigenous banks. So it's now back to us. Indigenous banks, indigenous oil companies. And I think it was Mr. Wigo that said, if you don't get the support of Nigerian banks, foreign banks won't do anything for you. So we are really there. Nigerian oil companies, Nigerian banks, Nigerian legal firms to draft the requirements. Perhaps I'm suggesting we should look for some kind of collaboration, since you are in the legal banking and you are in a building that was meant to be a petroleum and energy building at that time. So perhaps we should seriously look at how we can come up with some kind of unofficial committee. We have the bankers committee, we have our OPTS, we have our indigenous companies. Perhaps we need something that the government has their interministerial groupings. We too should have our own interdisciplinary groupings. Legal, petroleum club, money guys, oil companies. So that we can see how best, with all the constraints Mr. Wiggy put out there of the requirements of banks to fund, so we can do something. Because if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it for us. And in any case, by 2050, the footprints are not going to be there.
Thank you very much for that. That's very, very insightful. But I think the Nigerian banks are coming some way from being able to fund 5 million to, what was it, 10 billion exposure to the sector. They're making an effort.
Thank you for that question. One of the problems I have in our country is that there isn't much dialogue between the private sector and government. For instance, this coming week we're going to have COP26. I'm not aware of how much bouncing of ideas have taken place between whatever government is going to present and the private sector. Maybe there is. You know, I always say I'm a retired man now, so my access to information diminishes very, very quickly. Those of you who are not retired know that once you're retired, your access to information. But I'm not aware that indeed there is any, for instance, coming to the Petroleum Club, say, what do you guys think about our policy of moving from fossil fuels to renewables? We should be talking to Fatona and any other people like NAPE, like SPE, people. I'm not saying that you should even take on their ideas, but you listen. You take a little bit from each person, and then you formulate a policy. But I get the sense that it doesn't happen. But it has to happen. Because there's so much information on both sides. It's only when you dialogue that you begin to formulate a policy that is strong. I listened to the CEPLAT session they had in Abuja 2-3 weeks ago, and I like what I heard there. It says net zero emission doesn't mean net zero fossil production. It doesn't mean that. So you're going to find a balance, particularly in a country like Nigeria where we continue to need revenues from oil and gas. You cannot have net zero fossil oil production. You can't. So there has to be a balance. To say, okay, how much can we produce? What is the transition plan we have? That transition plan may be acceptable or not acceptable, but at least formulate something. And that formulation
Frankly, I don't know how it happens. I wish I knew how it happens so that people like Lai Fatun as president can have an input in that formulation of policy. For me, I think that's very important.
Thank you very much. I believe our chairman has a few words as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am not asking this question or I'm not making this comment as chairman of Petroleum Club. I am representing myself. And it's very interesting to listen to Mr. Imomo speaking about leakages in production. And I think it's a very gentleman and very professional way of putting a very serious national problem into the public domain. As a practitioner, I know, and I speak from experience, that perhaps every producer in this country loses up to 60 to 70% of their production to stealing. What bugs me to almost a point of going nuts is, why is government not recognizing that this is a very serious national malady? Now, if we individually as producers lose 60% of our production, government is losing 60% of its royalties. And whatever it is, the computation of what Nigeria is expected to produce by sheer OPEC quota, if 60% of what we actually produce is stolen, then you can already see why we will never be able to meet our OPEC quota. So the cumulative effect of the fact that production does not get to terminal is a very serious national problem. It's as serious as COVID, as far as I'm concerned. Because that is the quantum of revenue that is not available to you and I through the auspices of the revenue account. I don't know what Bite or Herbert would say, but from the operator's mindset, this is a very significant national issue. And it has to be, we need to talk about it, but nobody's talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's late into the night. It's been a very, very exciting, interesting evening. Certainly, I've had lots of fun. I've learned a lot, but we're going to have to draw it to a close because, at some point the fun has to stop. But we would like to, on behalf of the Petroleum Club, present some commemorative plaques to the speakers who have graced us with their experience and knowledge and answered questions. Can I please call on Dr. Swaley to present, if you will, sir, plaques to... Please, sir, to Mr. Egbesimama and to Dr. Igwe as well. If we could have the chairman up as well for a picture, that would be fantastic. So that's for, yeah, so that's for Mr.
On behalf of the Petroleum Club, we'd like to make this presentation to you, Mr. Egbert Imomo, CON KSG. So when they were introducing you, I was a little peeved that the KSG part was not mentioned. So now that I have the microphone, I'll mention the KSG part. Congratulations, thank you very much. You are one of us anyway.
Dr. Wigwe, please. Want us to come up? I hope everybody can see us. Dr. Herbert Wigwe. I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of Petroleum Club for sponsoring this evening. And not only just sponsoring, but also your speech and your talk, and giving us the background for many of us in the industry, indigenous, how we can ensure we successfully access finances. And I hope you take the suggestions I made earlier on between the two of you. Thank God you are here, seriously, and then we do something about it. Thank you very much for your presentation and your sponsorship. Thank you very much. Oh, don't go. Well, Mr. Agbitadeniji, you have changed since the last time I saw you, Mr. Adeniji. But anyway, yes, we are representing him. I hope he's still online. Good. Michelle, I'm glad you are being represented by somebody much prettier than you. Thank you very much for your presentation and the serious work you did, Michelle, that is, in getting PIA to where we finally found it after more than 20 years. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Before we take this group picture, may I respectfully invite Mr. Austin Aburu, our Vice Chairman. Please join us, sir. You can't escape.
And on that note, before we all hurriedly escape, let me very profusely thank first all the speakers for this evening, the keynote speaker, Benga Oyebode, and all the supporting papers that were presented. And then let me specifically thank our sponsors, and even twice as much, the group CEO of Access Bank, who didn't only sponsor, he's been with us all evening and presented such a great paper. It's fast making Access Bank a household banking support for everybody, small and large entrepreneurs. So we're happy to have you here. And of course, everybody who has spent so much time here. I think we had a very good evening. It's been an evening of excellent networking. It's been a gathering of industry eggheads and professionals. And discussions have been fantastic. And so for all of us who have spent all the time this evening, I will tell you that we're going to make this a regular quarterly event of this kind of quality going forward from Petroleum Club. So to all of you, I'll say thank you very much and enjoy the evening as you all go home. Travel safe, stay safe, and all have a good night. Thank you very much.
Well, good night, everybody. Thank you. See you next time.
my Valentine. Can I hit the making with temperature there? If you leave me a good time, I swear. You are like the oxygen I need to survive. I'll be honest. Loving the thought of me, I am so obsessed. I want to chop your heart. Never did it back and it's you. Open up, make us you. Give me love, one thing. Make a bad man sing. $1,000 I go spend for your head. Talk all they want, I don't care what they say, cause your matter. Now you my con they carry for my head every night. Now you I want to carry to my bed, oh no no. Don't tell me no no no. You can be my partner, never ride it solo no. And we got no one lucky, no need to party whoa. I feel it what you're doing, oh yeah baby, gotta go, gotta go. Your body they back at me, see. Open up, make I see. Now you where they got my fancy. Don't they do me, I get banky, oh no 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 no. Gini kanachano imana chukwa gazi tomo onya no miu yellow you me. What am I looking for? Say my God, it don't mess me up. They giving me you, giving you me. Opposite keep and my chest so. Opposite keep and my chest me. My baby, you know say you got love for me. I do go. When I call your name, shakara for me. Nora, no, man. I go be your you go be my Julie. Nora, no, man. I go be your you go be my Julie. Give me your heart, I no go run away. Show me your love, I no go use you play. Carry me, go me, I go follow away. Follow you, oh. Me and you. Okwamona, keep my baby. Me and you. Okwamona, keep my baby. Opposite keep and la chase so. Opposite keep and me chase me. My baby, you know say you got love for me. I do go. When I call your name, shakara.